Hey, I have a second channel. Cube Comp MTDX. Hey everybody, look at what the cat dragged in tonight. We got this old HP Pavilion 6630, and it's already been kind of gutted, and it's not the original hardware that's in it now. Some of the hardware is still original, but the motherboard and stuff's been changed out. It was an old little project machine I had from some time back when. This reminds me of a computer my grandpa used to have. I don't know what the model of the machine that he had was, but his sported a Celeron 667 MHz CPU. I think 64 gigabytes of SD RAM and 20 gig hard drive. This one used to have a Celeron 500 MHz CPU, 64 megabytes of SD RAM, and a 10 gigabyte hard drive. Now, at some point, I took out the original motherboard and I put in something else that's a little bit newer. There's a look at the back of it. Again, as mentioned, original motherboard is not in there anymore. Socket 370 Intel based motherboard. CPU, I can't remember for sure if it was a Coppermine based Celeron, which is based off the Pentium 3, or if it was the original Celeron that came out on, I think, Socket 370. It was the one that had the giant, I guess you'd call, heat spreader on top, and was it was nearly indestructible. You could take the heatsink off and actually run it without a heatsink, and it would get super hot enough to boil water, but it would still run stable. And I think I have a video featuring that CPU up on the channel, and it may have been the motherboard that came out of it. May have been the CPU motherboard that came out of this thing. So I'm going to put a link right up here if I have it. We're going to do a little transformation on this old computer. We're going to do some upgrades to it. It's going to be getting much newer HP hardware. It's going to keep its old looks on the outside, but it's going to be a totally different system on the inside. So let's go ahead and take off this panel. You should, like a keyword, should slide off. We shall see. The entire panel comes off, and I tell you, this model of computer, again, it brings back memories, because back in the day, my grandpa bought one of these brand new in 2001. Wasn't the same model as this. This is a 6630. This is a little bit different. I no longer have that one. Same case though, same look. Had Windows ME on it, or Windows Me, excuse me. That was the computer that I spent time on when I was at my grandparents' house. I would either be doing stuff through AOL on the internet, because back then they had just dial-up, and either that, or I'll be just doing something else on it. Matter of fact, that computer was the first machine I ever discovered Windows Movie Maker, and kind of sparked my interest in editing video. And also, my mom, the computer technician back then, my mom, who was known to replace modems and upgrade memory, she had opened it up a couple of times to replace a modem and things like that. Here's a look inside the system here. I think I've got my hands on at least a couple of these things over the years, and I'll explain why in a second. So you're looking inside here, and it's like, okay, how the heck can you access things like on the motherboard and stuff like that when you got this power supply unit right in the way? Well, guys, this old little thing has a removable motherboard tray. So you can take the motherboard tray right out. And I'm getting ready to do that right now, actually, so that way I can get access to the motherboard and stuff. Now, here's the funny thing, guys. So let's go ahead and take this out first, and I'll show you. I don't remember if there's any more screws on this or not. Oh yeah, right there on the side. And this motherboard tray comes right out, which reveals the installed motherboard. And again, this is not the original. Let's get you a better look here. So take one moment to get a good look at that motherboard tray. Now let's go here and look at the computer plexi. Does that look familiar? Yeah guys, the plexi has a motherboard tray out of one of those old HP computers. I had like 2 of these kicking around. This one right here may very well be from my grandpa's computer. Who knows? Because I parted out a long time ago. And I think a second one came from Hopewell High School, where of course we had all the spare computer parts to build the plexi systems back in the day. So that was where the second one came from. That's how I ended up with 2 of those trays. They had one of these at Hopewell High School as a parts donor system that got gutted. And my grandpa's computer was based off of this, and it too got gutted. That being said, I had installed this little motherboard in here. I never actually did complete this build. My ideas back in the day were to use this little computer to operate a Magic Jack, and this is back before Magic Jack Plus came out. The old Magic Jack, you had to have a computer running all the time, so my idea back then was to set up this little computer here to basically run a Magic Jack. Yeah, not very power efficient compared to what we have now. Of course, Magic Jack Plus and Magic Jack Go plug into a USB for power, and they plug straight into your wireless router. So, or switch or whatever. That being said, let's go ahead and take this motherboard out. That'll be the first thing, which is going to take this motherboard out. And what's nice is this old computer case from 2000. I want to say 2000, might be 1999, because this thing actually had Windows 98 on it. I do think. Let me look at the front again. Yeah, it originally had Windows 98 on it. Not sure if the case has a Windows 98 product key sticker. Don't see one on the panel. How about the bottom? Not sure. Don't see a key. But anyways, so go ahead and take out this motherboard here. And I want to say this motherboard may have used something intended from like mobile, like a laptop CPU. I don't know. I mean, the little sticker says 1500 plus on it. Could be like some sort of Athlon XP from back then. That would be a pretty low end one. Because I think Athlon XP's original, I think later Athlon XP's eventually got up to 3200 plus. Okay, so we're going to take this motherboard out of here. And who knows, maybe I'll throw it into another case and just play around with it a little bit. Probably nothing too special. Probably just your basic, like I say, a 1500 plus, whatever that is. And probably some crappy VIA S3 graphics to boot, since this has a VIA chipset on it. You got I want to say it has 256 megabytes of DDR on this thing. Probably yeah, PC 2100. Should be able to take this. Oh, there's one more screw there. Let's see. Of course. Okay, we'll take that off and set it to the side. Knock out the original I/O shield. This thing does appear to be dated 2000. It looks like January 12th of 2000 was when this case was manufactured. So this is an early 2000 computer that came out just before. I'd say it came out just before Windows 2000 and Windows Me. Windows Me would have been pre-installed on something like this. So it's probably a good thing it didn't get Windows Me. Had 98 SE on it instead, because Windows Me was just terrible. But I mean, it wasn't 100% terrible, but it was kind of terrible. It did the job for my grandpa's computer, and like I say, it offered some neat things that came out before Windows XP. But of course, Windows XP was the real deal. All right, so I'm gonna pop this new I/O shield in here, and then I'll show you what I'm putting in this thing. And what I'm putting in here, I think, has been featured on the channel before. I did an upgrade on the system back in 2020, right when COVID was starting up. So, got this little guy right here. I think it's socket 1155 Intel Sandy Bridge. I think it's a Celeron G640 or 460. I can't remember for sure. I just put this cooler on here, and you may see how I got the fan blowing upward instead of downward. Well, you may have seen inside this system, the power supply sits right above it. So it's got 4 gigabytes of DDR3 memory on there. So going from 64 megabytes to 4 gigabytes of RAM, quite an improvement there. So first I need to make sure that this will fit on here, which it should. Now the thing is about this case is, you see how I got this piece of electrical tape right here? That's because some of these cases had this little standoff that was permanently attached. It's like that right there, and for some reason a lot of motherboards simply didn't have a screw hole there, so I had to put something there to keep the motherboard from grounding out against the tray. Alright, that being said, let's try to get this back in there again, because I think we're good other than that. So I have to find an expansion slot cover to let's kind of cover this up, because of course this motherboard has no expansion slots. It's just a basic little, say, ITX motherboard. And you may notice how there's no power connection on it. That's because this motherboard actually gets its power from a laptop adapter, 19.5 volt laptop adapter. So I'll have to show you that here in a sec. So, considering it gets its power from a laptop adapter, you can imagine that we can't have a powerful CPU on this thing. Matter of fact, this motherboard is limited to a top TDP rating of 35 watts. And of course, on 1155, I think it is, there's not many offerings that have that low of a TDP design. Now, the funny thing about Intel is they've here lately, I guess I can say they've been kind of caught lying about their TDPs a little bit. Although the TDP isn't exactly a rating of how much power the processor can pull, at least from my understanding. It used to be a good general. It used to give you a good, just rough figure of how much power the CPU would pull just under general load. We're not talking about like turbo boost or anything like that, but there were some Intel CPUs, I forget what models, I'd seen this online, where the CPUs would pull far more than their TDP ratings. So, Now, as far as this little guy goes, this motherboard, I do think there were a few like Core i3s that could run that had low enough TDPs. Like you could actually install a higher end i5 or whatever on here, just any like Intel chip of that socket. It would turn on, but it will give you a message on the screen telling you that the CPU installed exceeds the TDP maximum for this motherboard, and the system shuts off. So it has a built-in protection there. So that being said, let's go ahead and look at the connectors on the back here. And you can see we have a DVI out, we got a VGA out, we got 4 USB 2s, got a fast Ethernet there, you got your audio, and right there we have our DC in. You can see right there, you would plug in a HP 65, I think it's either 65 or 95 watt laptop adapter into this and power this thing off of that. I think I have actually ran this off of a 65 watt adapter before, at least when I was testing the motherboard. So this motherboard, it powers the optical drive and the hard drive from itself. It takes in the 19.5 volts and does DC to DC conversion to convert it to your 3.3, your 5, your 12 volts, all that good stuff. So now that we got the motherboard installed on a tray, we're not going to install it back into the system just yet because we got a little more stuff here to do. And it's nice to do this without there being stuff in here, because I got to get a look in here and see what all there is. And it appears, I'm trying to see here, I was going to say it looks like this computer might be missing a hard disk tray. I can't say for certain on that, because I'm looking at it and I'm just, yeah, it does appear this thing is missing its original drive cage, which is unfortunate. But we got this power supply unit in here, and of course what I'm putting in here does not need a power supply, so I'm not going to leave this hole just wide open. I mean, one option would be I could put a I could cut out a piece of like sheet steel the size of this hole and just cover it up. But the motherboard that we're putting in here requires you to have the system fan populated. Besides, you want a system fan anyway to help draw air to the system. So what we're going to do, we're going to get a little creative here. We're going to take out this power supply, this Bestech ATX 100-5 power supply, yeah, 100 watt power supply, and we're going to gut it. We're going to gut it of its internals. That way we can just use the case to mount a system fan into. So let's go ahead and take out the power supply. And I know I'm not getting you the best view of this, but let's take the power supply out and we'll open it up. Okay. Should be able to pull the power supply right out of this thing. And I will say that even though these power supplies are rated just for a measly 100 watts, I mean, this computer itself did not really pull that much power. And just we'll get a good look at the ratings in just a moment. It'll probably help if I actually unplug all the connections in this thing, including the CD drive. Alright, the little power supply unit is out, so we'll go ahead and crack it up in here in just a sec. Get this case out of the way here. So again, as mentioned, we're going to totally gut this power supply of its internals. So get you a look at the spec label. Again, this is a Bestech model ATX 100-5. Puts out just 100 watts. Most of its power is put out on the 5 volts and 3.3 volt rails. The 12 volts, the 12 volt rail can only do 2 amps or 24 watts. Now, that's what the sticker says. This power supply The one that came out of my grandpa's computer, my buddy Tim back in the day, he got it to modify into powering stuff. Kind of like how I'm doing here with my lights. And of course, despite the power supply being mostly 5 volt heavy, he ran some 12 volt stuff off of it. And let me just say, he highly exceeded the 12 volt output rating of this thing. He had the thing loaded down so hard it was actually starting to smoke. It never actually burnt up. Matter of fact, that power supply is probably still in my parents' attic somewhere, hooked up to a little Peltier fridge. I ran it. I used it to run a Peltier fridge for quite some time, and I did a video on YouTube of that unit. I called it, the ATX 100-5, the little fighter, and I'll put a link right up here if you want to go to it and check that out. So that being said, let's go ahead and open this thing up. My original plan was to fix this unit. That was kind of why I had held off on finishing up that build. This unit, I think, had some failed caps in it, which we'll see here in just a sec. Never been opened before, so I got to cut this seal here. Oh yeah, we definitely got some failed caps in this thing. So, this is an older Bestech unit. Now, for those who don't know, Bestech was notorious back in the day for their infamous ATX-250-12E power supply that got installed into e-machine systems. That unit had a crappy 5 volt standby rail. I think it's an analog 5 volt standby rail. It didn't have like a digital IC to control it, and it didn't have protection. So when the capacitors failed, the 5 volt standby rail would go high, fry the motherboard, and usually the power supply, it would be like the equivalent of a murder-suicide. The power supply would murder the motherboard and then commit suicide of itself. I've got a couple of those units ticking around, and I've got several videos up on the channel from years back of talking about these units, because back then e-machine systems were actually still a little more common back then, or at least e-machine computers that were running that model of power supply. And I was really just trying to get the word out, because there were plenty of those units still in service, still working at the time, that hadn't committed their crime just yet. And I pretty much wanted to make sure that people were aware of this unit and get it changed out as soon as possible. This unit here, I'm not sure if it had the same issue, but there's a chance that it could, because it's an older model than the 250-12E. But it could also have that crappy 5 volt standby design. Now what's funny is this unit, it must have reported to the computer the fan speed. Well, I mean, the fan, this power supply, acts as a system fan, but what's funny is the power supply does not have a tack wire, so I don't know how that was supposed to work. Maybe it was to override the fan speed of the power supply. Sometimes, I know I'm doing a lot of talking in this video. But, perhaps maybe the fan control on this power supply unit had a sort of an override function, to where it would monitor the fan speed input from the motherboard for a system fan, and if it decided to crank up the fan speed, maybe it would increase its own fan speed. Alright, so now I think we're in the clear almost. Got a couple more things to take loose. yeah, guys, I'm literally taking everything out that I can. First, I gotta try to get this PCB out of there, and we'll get a look at the PCB once I get it out, in case some of y'all may want to see what this power supply looks like up close, or at least the internals. Or some of y'all might be interested in that. Down the side there is another screw. Ah. Okay, so the camera ran out of memory while I was tearing this apart, so I got the PCB out and I had to wrestle with this thing to get the socket out for the AC input. I also took the 120 240 or 115 230 switch out of there. The idea is I open this up as much as I can so that way it can get decent airflow through it. I'll take this out here since it's no longer needed. So let's get you a look at this power supply PCB for those who want to see it. Again, this was an ATX 100-5. It's littered full of the JPCT or the JPCE-2R capacitors that Best Tech used back around 2000. They went from that brand to Jamicon, and Jamicon wasn't the greatest either, but they were generally somewhat okay. And they went to OST, or actually no, TPO and some OST depending on the unit. But I mean, there's not a whole lot there, but this thing is pretty beefy feeling for being just 100 watts. I'll say that. And of course, being so tiny, they had to cram everything in here. And of course, got lots of failed capacitors over here on the secondary. There's our primaries there. They're just 330 microfarad. Not very big. So that being said, you look at the bottom. That being said, let's go ahead and prep this power supply case. What we got to do here is change out that fan for one that has a 3-pin connector with the built-in tack. Okay, there's the old fan, which seems to be still good. I could probably use it in another power supply if I need to replace a fan in one. Okay, so I went and found a 80mm case fan with a 3-pin connection on it with the tack wire. The reason is, I think I'll mention again, this motherboard, it requires it. It will allow the system to boot up without it, but it will give you a nag message every time you start the system. It'll say system fan failed or not detected or whatever, blah blah blah, and you can't disable it. Typical OEM. So I'm going to pop this in there. We'll leave this little grill intact. Okay, so we got the fan mounted. All I gotta do now is just run the lead down through here and just reinstall the cover on the original PSU case. Okay, so now our power supply is ready to be mounted back into the system, or mock power supply as I'll call it. It's not actually being a power supply, it's just being more or less a case fan in a little box. Okay everybody, so there's a couple of things I did off camera. This is actually resuming this project on a different day. Like I say, a couple of things. Number one is I made my own hard disk cage. Well, I didn't make it myself, I just figured out a way to install it in this case. The actual hard drive cage is actually out of a Dell Dimension system, such as, let's say, I think the 2400. That era of Dell chassis. I just drilled a hole in the bottom of the case. That way I could just run a screw right through the bottom. You can see right there. Maybe you'll see screws ticking down. I just drilled a hole and used one of these screws to tap the threads and trash that screw, and then installed this one, and it holds this perfectly fine. Now it's funny, it does move a tad bit, but it actually did the same thing in the actual original Dell. So another thing I did is I've installed, or if you want to call it that, I've actually set in place this card reader slash USB ports slash audio jack. This will bring some modern ports to the front of this system. That way, I mean, you can insert more things into it than just say a CD or a floppy drive, or floppy disk rather. I changed out the old CD-ROM drive for this DVD-ROM drive. And you may be wondering about the floppy disk drive. Well, of course, most new motherboards these days do not have a floppy disk controller built into them. So you're thinking, okay, the floppy disk is going to be there, the floppy drive is going to be there just for looks. Actually, no. I did manage to find on Amazon a USB to floppy adapter. It plugs into the back of the floppy disk drive, on where the ribbon cable would normally go. It's a little circuit board that plugs into that, and it has a USB cable on that plugs in. Well, by default, the way it's designed, it plugs into a USB port, which I'm going to have to change that. I'm going to have to desolder the cable and install an internal header cable, like I did in the Mid-Tower Lux. But the little circuit board actually powers the floppy drive, and it runs off of USB power. So even though this little motherboard here does not, and of course this little motherboard only has power outputs for two SATA drives, the optical drive and hard drive, in the floppy power, it will get its power through USB and it'll be fully functional. So we will actually retain functionality of the original floppy disk drive, which I think is pretty cool. Even though the floppy disk drive will probably hardly ever get used, it'll still be there and ready to go if it's ever needed. Another thing I like to mention is, of course, now these cables right here, which some of them are sticking out here. I mean, we've got, let's see, two USB headers. We got this audio header here, but the case, the case front panel connection for the power button, power LED, and hard drive activity LED, they use the same modern pinout as what a lot of motherboards use nowadays. And what was funny is back in the day when HP manufactured this system, I think the original motherboard did not actually follow this pinout. They just had a little adapter that would plug into this, and it would plug into the motherboard to adapt this style connector to that motherboard. But again, it's cool. I can plug this right into this motherboard here, and it'll work just fine. So yeah, all I really lack to get this thing to run is gotta install a hard disk drive in that cage, and then just mount the motherboard. The USB to floppy controller will be arriving from Amazon, I think, tomorrow. So I'll get to install that. But hey, at least I can go in and start throwing this thing back together. Okay, so I got a 80 gigabyte hard drive I'm going to toss into this thing. This is actually the smallest SATA hard drive I have. Yeah, 80 gigabytes is definitely not big by today's standards, but for just a little project like this, I figured I'll just use it. Because I definitely wouldn't install this into a computer I'm selling. It's just, in my opinion, a little too small of a capacity. But for basic use, it would actually be fine. I ain't planning on putting a whole bunch of files on this thing anyhow. So let's take these screws out. And this cage comes right out. Now it's got a mount hard disk in here. Okay, so the hard drive is now mounted in place. Gotta tighten the screw up here. Alright, so with the hard drive mounted, this does actually firm up a bit more. So now, so I should mention, for at least for the time being, I'm just going to leave this kind of loose in there as it is. Since I think now I'm done with the everything on the front, I can go ahead and snap the front bezel back on. Okay, so now the hard drive is in. We got our optical drive swapped out. We got this little card reader sitting in there, and what I'm probably doing is I'll probably end up just gluing that into place and putting maybe something to fill this in up at the top here. Bet to get me a piece of plastic cut the size to fill this little hole here in, but I mean, progress is progress, I reckon. So we still have pretty good access to this side of everything, and what I can do now is I can go and start prepping the motherboard to mount into the system. So and grab it, and got to grab a couple SATA cables. Got to grab a couple SATA power connectors for this board, which I have some, and just get everything hooked up and get this installed into place. Okay, so we got two SATA cables. And this one here I'll plug into the DVD drive, which I'll have to readjust the camera, move this stuff around a little bit so you can see what I'm doing. So it's really just a matter of plugging all the connectors in. At first I was going to plug everything into the tray. I was like, wait a second. Better plug everything into the actual, drives. So we got that, and we're going to need a power connection. Motherboard has these little SATA power leads. You got a SATA power connection on one side, and you got this little lead that plugs into the motherboard on this side. So I'm going to pop this into the DVD drive. And we'll plug in our SATA data and power leads to the hard drive. The idea is to have some slack available because, of course, want to be able to connect the cables up and then slide the motherboard tray back into the system. It's kind of the idea. They give you enough slack in the cables to set the motherboard tray down next to the system. That way you can connect everything up and then you can install the motherboard tray into the tower. Well, if you want to call it that, ain't much of a tower. It's funny, this thing is back from, you know, Y2K. This is back from the good old days when it seemed like PC manufacturers were trying to shrink things and make stuff smaller. I mean, you had these little micro towers back then that were just absolutely just crammed together. And you had these little micro ATX power supplies, which, I mean, you still have them out there in small form factor computers. I think now they call these SFX power supplies or small form factor power supplies. Sometimes they go by micro ATX, it depends. Kind of like the motherboard in a way. So, got to remove a motherboard tray here. So all we have to do is just plug in our respective connectors. And what's nice about this little motherboard here is the USB headers on this board match up perfectly to the USB headers, or the USB internal cables for what I installed in the front. And that's because I pretty much the ports that you had seen were gutted from a newer HP case. I may have a video up on the channel from when I did this a while back. I was a friend of mine was wanting to have some upgrades done to our computer, and the piece of crap case simply did not offer enough expansion to do what I needed to do. So I completely gutted the system and put its guts into I think it was an Acer tower or a Gateway tower, I can't remember for sure. That way I was able to install a capture card, an actual real DVD drive, not this piece of crap laptop drive that they're putting in desktops now. So that's where I got like this stuff here from. So what's cool is it's just a matter of plugging this right in. And now I will mention though, the USB connections generally do follow a standard. You got your 5 volts and your 2 data pins and a ground. These HP leads, I think they have a couple of extra grounds on the end in addition to the standard USB 2.0 pinout. So what's nice is the motherboard works perfectly with it. And we got this extra one here for I think the card reader that's built into that. And I'll have one more USB port left over, which will be used for that floppy disk drive. We've also got our audio header here, HD audio. Just plugging these into the motherboard here. We got our SATA data leads. We got our SATA power, which that's going to be a little tough to get to because these are not quite long enough. I'll have to plug these in right before I'll have to plug these in right as I go to install the motherboard into the system. They'll be long enough to reach otherwise. It'd be nice if they would include a little additional length on those, but it is what it is. We've also got our fan lead. Here it is. I was like, where is it? We got our system fan, which of course we got mounted inside the power supply unit. And of course it's mounted up top too on this motherboard, so I'll just have to go ahead and plug these in. Of course, as much as I dread it, this thing's going to be kind of a rat's nest. Oh wait, let's not forget our also got our front panel connection, which it does have enough slack there to plug right in. Okay, so as mentioned, I selected a fan that had a nice long lead on it, but despite that, it's still gonna be kind of tight. It'll still work. Just gotta plug that and those two other power connections for the drives in right before I install this. Yeah, those are kind of close. And we got the one for the optical drive. This don't want to pull on that other cable so hard because it's connected to the hard drive. So in hindsight, what I'll probably, well, in the future, what I'll probably do is I'll plug that one into the motherboard and then install the motherboard and then plug the power connection into the hard drive. So. Alright, so before I go to install the motherboard tray, show what I'm working with here. You can see the motherboard and all the various things plugged into it. Still need to install something right here to cover that, which I'll do here in just a sec. But I'll probably actually save that for the end because I'm going to be opening this thing back up anyway to install the floppy adapter. But yeah, you can see kind of how it's going together. And I tell you, these old machines, they were definitely, I'd say, a rat's nest as far as cable management goes. I mean, they were so tiny, it was just so hard to work with them. Especially when you had this removable tray for the motherboard, which now I'll go ahead and insert back into place. Okay guys, so I just did a test fit and I had one clearance issue. It was the little locking mechanisms on the RAM modules on this side. So I actually cut them off with the pliers. I wouldn't exactly recommend doing that, but it was the only way I was going to be able to get this thing to fit in there because the little latches there were actually bumping up against the bottom of this 5 1/4 inch drive cage there. So the DIMM modules will actually be just below it. It's a tight fit. The RAM modules will still be locked in on the bottom, so I mean, fingers crossed don't have any issues. I guess a redneck measure would be to glue the modules in up here, but I just don't really like the idea of doing that. But I'll be honest, I've came across some newer Matrock motherboards on socket AM4 with DDR4 slots that had locking mechanism, had locks on just one side. It was weird. So the actual modules themselves are not the problem. It was those little locks. So I'll just have to rely on just one set of locks. And the module does stay in there, at least. Yeah, it's I mean, yeah, you could theoretically lift it, but I mean, it's in there pretty good and tight. So I don't think we got too much to worry about there. So this computer, I'm not selling it to anybody. It's just a little project of mine, and I mean, it might get used, who knows, by a family member or something, or somebody I know. But I mean, sometimes for these little experimental projects, I guess you gotta do what you gotta do. You know, the module, I mean, yeah, I could lift it, but I don't think it's got too much I don't think there's too much to worry about there, really, to be honest. I don't think it's going to back out. I'll just leave it like it is, just like that. And plug these connections back in. Now I should mention the way this case works, the tray kind of goes in like that. I guess to give you some sort of an opportunity to try to tidy up stuff in there, but like I say, it's just so dang difficult with this thing. I tell you, these early 2000s computers were a real rat's nest for a reason. But what we're putting in there is not anything that puts out a lot of heat, so I mean, it's really weird how this thing goes together. It's kind of aggravating too. More like very aggravating, to be honest. Okay, so the motherboard tray is installed. Right now I'm just going to make sure the CPU fan is not jammed or anything, and it's not. Yeah, the cables on this thing, it's just a freaking nightmare how they designed these machines back then. So I'm going to try to work those out of the way if I can. Key word is if I can. Try to get them away from the CPU fan. I know you can't see what I'm doing, but it's just it's probably a good thing I installed the CPU fan backwards, to where it sucks in air from toward the motherboard and blows it upward. Because otherwise I would have most likely I've had to find a cage to put over the top of it. I mean, I tell you, my mom's E-machine, her first E-machine back in the day, E-machine's T1840, had a Celeron 1.8 gigahertz socket 478 CPU. The cooler actually had a fan grill over it. It was a 70mm fan on an aluminum heatsink, and it actually had a fan grill on top of it. It was like the only ones I've seen with the CPU fan having a grill over it. But like I say, these things are pretty tight. So power supply fan, well, if you want to call it that, is right up on the other side of that, and it will suck air out of the system and blow it out the back. So okay, guys. So the internal floppy disk drive adapter or controller arrived, and it simply works via USB. It plugs into a USB source, and it powers the drive via USB with this little adapter cable. This actually powers the internal floppy disk drive, and this plugs into the floppy disk drive on the back. But one thing I cannot stand about these things is this right here. The fact that they include an external USB cable, USB-A cable, when most likely you're going to be installing this inside a PC. Now, most computers typically don't have USB ports inside them. They have headers on the motherboard, which accept, that. So I don't understand the whole logic behind this right here. One thing you may be able to do is I think they do actually make adapters that you can install on your motherboard to provide a USB port inside the motherboard, which you could just plug this right into. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually desolder this and solder on that proper cable. Okay, everybody, so finally, we got this little floppy disk drive controller mounted to the floppy drive. Now the crazy thing is I had to swap out the floppy drive that was in this computer for a different one because the floppy disk drive that was in the system had the ribbon connection on the far left of the back of the drive. Well, the CPU cooling fan was right in the way. And it's hard to see there, but you can probably see the CPU fan back there. It was literally right in the way. So I had to pull this drive out, or the one I was in there, pull that one out and change out for a different one, different brand. And let me tell you, back in the old days, I despised computer cases that had this style floppy drive to where the front is totally missing, and this little button here literally slips onto this metal piece right there. Instead of using a drive with a typical faceplate already on it, like for example the mid-tower Lux case, it has a decorative front to where the front of the floppy drive is not actually showing, but the floppy drive itself does still have its faceplate intact, and the button on the front of the case sort of pushes this button right here. Much prefer that. So yeah, I despised this design back then. I despise it now because I had to do some modifications. I had to rip off a faceplate, or yeah, the faceplate off of a floppy drive. I think it's this one right here. Might have been it. Had to rip it off, and actually no, it was this right here. You see, it's got the little door in it, and that's why this floppy drive no longer has a door in it. So, I mean, for example, I'll pop this in there. The funny thing is when you go to eject the floppy disk, well, it ejects it all right into your lap. I actually uploaded a short of this last night, calling it a computer with an attitude. So I still got to do a little bit of cosmetic work on the exterior. I got to cover this hole up right here, and got to fasten down these USB ports and this card reader and headphone jack, and make me some sort of filler right there. But hey, I mean, it's giving this old computer case some, I guess we could say, somewhat modern ports. I mean, we still don't have USB 3 or USB-C or any of that, but I mean, having USB 2 and having an SD reader on the front and headphone jack on this thing, I mean, that was kind of a big step back in this machine's time. Now, I could have went out and purchased a some sort of 3.5-inch dry bay thing. Now, I'll give you those modern ports, but the motherboard itself does not even have USB 3. So, that's why we stuck with USB 2, and I happen to have this kicking around, so, I mean, it's pretty cool. The thing's pretty cool. It had 2 USB 2 ports, an SD reader, and a audio jack built into one. So, now that we've got the floppy disk drive controller in there, to give this old computer case its original, floppy drive. Now let's go ahead and actually test this thing out. Keep our fingers crossed it'll work. Okay, so I got this thing plugged up to power, and I got it plugged up to video as well as a keyboard and mouse. And the funny thing is, I've got it plugged into a Dell 95 watt adapter, because Dell and HP, they used the same connector for at least a few years, and it is electrically compatible. Even though some HP laptops would complain if you plugged in a Dell adapter, they would still power up, but they wouldn't charge a battery or whatever. But anyway, let's go ahead and start this thing up. See if we're running on the right channel on this KVM switch. There we are. It does seem to take a while to actually post. I can't remember if it used to take that long or not, to be honest. Let's go back into setup again. I want to see if it's keeping date and time. No, it's not, so it's going to probably need a CMOS battery. Lovely. Lovely as ever. Well, let's see here. Let's see here. I want to see if it saved the settings I just entered in recently. Be the boot order. Oh yeah, the CMOS battery is definitely dead in this thing, so I'm going to have to replace that CMOS battery before I proceed forward with this. So it looks like I might have to pull that motherboard tray out again. Ah, lovely. Okay, so I located the CMOS battery, and it's right down there. So I think I can get at it without taking the motherboard tray out. I'm going to pull the quote-unquote power supply out, even though we know this is not the power supply anymore. We can pull that out of the way, and that should give us easier access to that battery. Oh, perfect! I can get right to it. Tell you what, guys, I do love this case for nostalgic reasons, but I must say I am certainly glad that HP moved on from this style chassis, because it is such a pain to get the stuff in here. I mean, of course, my modified version is probably a little more difficult to get access to stuff, but I think I mentioned earlier in this video that my mom actually had changed out a modem in my grandpa's old Pavilion way back when, and it was the same deal. You had to really tear into the machine to get access to stuff like that. You had to take that motherboard tray out, but once you got in, I mean, I'll tell you, that's just it. Everything's so jam-packed in there. Okay, so we'll pop this one down in there. That's what happens when motherboards, or computers in general, sit unplugged for a long period of time. Because that's when the CMOS battery really actually gets used. It helps, it retains date and time and settings when your computer is unplugged from a power source. Okay. So now, provided that battery's good, which maybe I should have tested it, but we'll know sooner or later if it's good or not. If it's not, I'll pluck it out and stick another one in there. Provided now it should retain settings, and that should stop it from taking so long to boot up. Because that's what it was doing, is it was loading default settings every time it started after being plugged back in. So we're going to go into a setup here. First thing we do is we need to set the date and time. And right now it thinks it is New Year's Day 2010. Man, that was a while back. 2010, that was my first semester in college. It is June 21st. And it is almost 1:30 in the morning. Okay, now I gotta go to boot order, and you can see it is seeing our USB floppy drive, which is, according to the motherboard, it's no different than an external floppy disk drive, like you would plug into the USB port. It's like the same thing, and it has it set as the first boot option. We're going to actually move that down to the last option for UEFI. Not sure why it says USB hard drive there. That's kind of odd. Probably because I don't have. Oh yeah, I know why. Duh. Because I do have my Windows 11 installer sitting in the USB port there. Now for legacy boot options, you can see it's got the CD drive first. It's got the floppy drive second, and it's got the hard disk drive options third. I'm gonna move those up to the top because if I'm gonna boot off of an alternative source, I can just go into the boot menu and set that. So anyways, we'll go ahead and accept those changes. Yeah, be careful on these crappy Hewlett-Packard SEB utilities that you don't press escape to get out of that, because otherwise it won't save your settings. So we look here at thermal, you can see it's just showing fan speeds, no temperatures. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save and exit. I'm going to attempt to boot into the Windows 11 USB installer. Yes, Windows 11. We're going to boot into the Windows 11 USB installer via UEFI. So let's see if this thing will actually get through post a little faster now. I'll tell you what, guys, it's cool seeing the HP splash screen there, because I mean, hey, it's in the old HP chassis. So going to the boot menu, and we're going to select now this BIOS. I will say that this BIOS does predate. It does happen to predate Windows 8. What I mean by that is the computer that the motherboard came in had Windows 7, but it came out not long before Windows 8 was released. So let's just try UEFI boot sources. See what happens here. Well, there's nothing there. Okay. We may have to install this via MBR and then try MBR to GPT conversion, see if that works. So while that's loading up, again, get you a good look at the front of this thing. I just love how the blue LED power indicator just lights up all over the front of this thing. Brings back memories for sure. But you see, the funny thing is, at first glance, the computer almost looks stock until you start noticing, you know, things like the ports up front and around back. You see the power supply unit. Well, there's no AC socket there, so there's a few things that that would catch your attention. Here we are in Windows setup. See, it looks like we may have to install this via MBR and then try to convert it to GPT. I'm going to say I don't have a product key. I'm going to choose Windows 11 Pro. This thing may already have a Windows Pro digital license on it already, at least the motherboard might. But if it doesn't, then it'll be a nice demo sample to do a video that some have been requesting, to do a in-place upgrade from Windows 7 to Windows 10, then from Windows 10 to Windows 11. So, select next here. The hard drive should be completely wiped. Yep, there's our hard disk. I'm going to say new and apply, and OK. and we'll select next, and we'll just let this do its thing. Okay, finally we're in. So I'll run through setup here. Now I should note the hard drive activity indicator is not wide open right now, so we can't really blame the hard drive for bottlenecking on this one, at least right now. And of course, as we know, it doesn't bother to ask us the important questions like what time zone are we in, or what is the current date and time. Giving it the three-finger salute, as some commenters have called it. Yeah, so I just gave it the three-finger salute, as somebody has called it on one of my videos. Control-Delete. And sign out to bypass the hi, we're happy you're here. Which I'm so used to doing this because we have to do it at work to get the login screen. But yeah, I'm going to do the three-finger salute again to get access to Task Manager. That way we can, well, we got our desktop now. Well, we can go in and bypass the OneDrive setup, because I do not need Microsoft OneDrive to install. I have no use for it. Go ahead and disable that. Make sure it's not trying to start up over here. I think we're good now. So, anyways, let's go ahead and have a look here at the settings. Go to performance. Or at least the specs, I mean. So 1.8 GHz CPU, Intel Celeron G4 60, 1.8 GHz. We got 256K of L2 cache, 1.5 megabytes of L3 cache. So yeah. Let's see here. View, update speed. I was looking for the anyways, I was looking at change graph to logical processors. So we have two logical processors on this processor. There, you can actually see a little better now. Got two logical CPUs, and still need to get our graphics driver installed. So I'll go ahead and allow this machine to hook up to the internet to fetch drivers. Now I mentioned that I was going to do an NBR to GPT conversion. I may hear in just a bit, but not just a second, because if for some reason it fails the conversion, then we just pretty much lost our Windows install, to start over again. But yeah, this is Windows 11 running on this old HP, if we want to call it that. Yeah, guys, it's just crazy. This old Hewlett-Packard Pavilion tower. Teeny tiny little thing. Let's get you a view. I'm going to minimize that. Let's get a view of this. Ain't that something? Oh yeah, I definitely need to test a floppy disk drive. So that floppy disk I got sitting on my desk. I'm not sure if it's actually a good one, but I'll try to pop it in there and see if it can read, or it might be corrupted. I don't know. So we go into well, go to File Explorer for one thing, access that. And if we go to this PC, You can see our floppy disk drive A is right there. Not sure if that floppy disk is any good or not, but it does show the floppy drive is actually functioning. And what's funny is this DVD drive apparently has a CD in it. Vision Tech. That's funny. Yeah, A is not accessible to disk media, is not recognized, it may not be formatted. It's probably just a bad disk at. I do have some good ones in a container in another room, but yeah, it's funny. So we've upgraded the motherboard to this much newer motherboard, and we've retained use of the floppy disk drive in this whole thing, which makes it seem more like a sleeper in a way. It's got a functioning floppy drive. We got Windows 11 loaded on it just for giggles. I will probably actually put Windows 10 on this at some point later on. But let's see here. I want to get access to a device manager. Does Windows 11? I come out and say I thought Windows 11 had that right-click option that Windows 10 does on its start button. So you can see this thing does run like a Celeron, not the fastest in the world, but it's funny. We're running Windows 11 on this whole thing. And our utilization, it's kind of up there, not exactly 100%. It's kind of a mix between, you know, the processor and the hard drive. And it's still in the process of fetching drivers and all that good stuff. And of course, once we plugged into our internet, it of course set our time zone back to Pacific time, like everybody is in Washington State where Microsoft is. Yeah, that's not exactly the case. It's too busy installing things like, you know, like Clipchamp and Adobe Express and stuff you'll never use. So it does appear that it activated. And go over and find time. Time and language, there we are. Date and time. And set the time zone to where it needs to be for our time zone. Eastern time. You think maybe by Windows 20 they'll get that figured out. maybe by Windows 20 or 25 they'll finally get that figured out. Oh, we're installing graphics drivers now, finally. So, maybe things will run a little smoother. Maybe. But, activation state, let's go have a look at that. It says it's activated. Got Windows 11 Pro on here. So, apparently this, as I kind of suspected, this motherboard at some point I did put Windows 10 Pro on it. Because I have actually used it for a couple of little projects over the past like year or two. But yeah, again, so the thing is running, and I know it's kind of went from the little sleeper build to this this sort of overview of Windows 11, but of course, since we've tested the floppy disk drive, video wouldn't be complete without testing the SD reader. I may have installed this thing upside down. I may have to fix that. Let me try inserting it this way. And you can see it looks like it's detecting the card. So yeah, I'll have to go in and flip that, flip this whole thing around. That way the USB ports and everything are facing the right direction. So, pull up File Explorer. I thought it detected something. Maybe it didn't. Okay, that's something I may have to look into, but, yeah. Pull this back out. But that's weird. You can see the I pulled it out and thought, okay, it's just what the deal is. It's just, yeah, a little delayed there. There it is, and you can see we can actually read media on this. And of course, this is just Windows 11 fresh out of the box. And if I go back one folder, and you see this right here is the reason why I downgraded from Windows 11 back to Windows 10 on Motorola Lux, is the lack of folder previews, which I think the next upcoming build of Windows 11, I think that's 22H2. I think that build of Windows 11 will indeed have folder previews. So yeah, pretty cool. The built-in SD reader is working, but unfortunately the whole thing's upside down. I have to flip it around. Anyway, let's go back in settings again. So yeah, 4 gigs of RAM, Celeron CPU, G4 60, 64-bit processor, Windows 11 Pro, 21H2. So we're about to get a new build of Windows 11 here pretty soon. I'll have to mess around with that a little bit, but yeah, I still got to do a little bit of cosmetic work to this whole thing. But hey, it is running Windows 11. So I guess you can say that's how you can install Windows 11 on old computers. You got to do a little modifications to it. Let's just put it that way. So, of course, as we all know, this computer's original hardware would definitely not run Windows 11. But so this is how you would get Windows 11 to run on something like this. Otherwise, yeah. Like I say, I still got a little work to do around here and like getting this all cleaned up. But yeah, we have breathed new life into this vintage Hewlett-Packard Pavilion chassis. This looks just like I say, it looks a lot like my grandpa's computer from back in the day. His was only slightly different, and his came with Windows Me when he bought it, and this machine here came with Windows 98. So, anyways, hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.
Well, everybody, that wraps it up for this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like the video. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and be sure to tick that bell so you'll get notified when new videos are posted. Also, don't forget, I have a whole lot of other interesting videos here on the channel to check out. And also, in addition, I have a second channel, CubeComp MTDX, where I have all sorts of other videos not exactly related to technology. Links to the channels are available at the end of this video. Again, I thank you for your support, and thanks for watching this video.